Well, I had started working in the coordination office of the U.S. Global Change Research Program in 1995, and I was there for 10 years. And that is the multi-agency $2 billion federal research program that supports all the observing systems and scientific work on climate, global environment. So I had come there from being on the professional staff of the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and had been working on climate change for a long time. So in that office, well, there was a senior staff position that supported the leadership, the federal science leadership. And one of the things I did, for example, was develop and edit the annual report to Congress of that program. What are we learning about climate change? What research programs are we supporting? Which agencies are doing what? What support do we need from Congress? Where do we go from here? That sort of thing. Many, many contributors throughout the federal government that I would bring together in communication to a wider audience. Well, it's in statute, the Global Change Research Act of 1990, and it is to coordinate the federal effort that includes NASA, NOAA, the Energy Department, EPA, the Pentagon, a lot of agencies, to coordinate their research effort to understand change in the Earth system and global environment. And really, what was driving the interest in having that program was, is global warming a problem? That was and stratospheric ozone and tropical deforestation. What do we need to know about these things? And Congress spun up and substantially funded the world's flagship research and observing system effort. I mean, through all of those early years, whatever the policy differences were on global warming, there was bipartisan support for research, and we wanted to maintain that. So I always saw it as the national intelligence capability for how human activity is affecting the Earth system. You know, that's a national treasure. That's something that needs to be protected and supported, and it has no end. It's mission driven. It's not just science because it's fun to do science. It's to inform the process of making policy and managing society, but it's intended to be an ongoing program, and still is. Well, you know, I mean, none of these administrations are above criticism, and there's always a kind of a tension between the world of science and the world of politics, and that's where that office was sitting, because on the one side of us we had the federal science executives and all the scientists they were supporting, but on the other hand, we also reported to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Of course, there's the congressional overseers, and that's a collision, the world of science and the world of politics. But I will say that under the Clinton-Gore administration, basically, I think that the White House was making a legitimate effort to translate scientific findings into policy ideas. I didn't see a fundamental conflict, but I was there during the changeover to the Bush-Cheney administration, and from fairly early on, it really seemed to me that we were dealing with a different animal. It started really during the first year in ways that weren't necessarily visible to the outside world, but spinning the language of a National Academy of Sciences report, directing me from the White House to delete from the next report to Congress all references to the National Assessment of Climate Change Impacts that our office, our program, had just completed putting together, delete references to the findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the president saying, yes, the Earth is changing, but question, does human activity have anything to do with it? And that sort of thing. That started early, and you know, I got the sense that rather than taking the science as it was given to them and dealing with policy issues, and there's plenty of room to debate about policy issues and who pays what and so forth. They came in with a predetermined political agenda, which is we were not going to regulate the energy industry, to make a very long story very short, and then they were willing to alter climate change communication to conform it to their political agenda. It really kicked in during 2002, when it wasn't clear exactly what was happening at first, but essentially a former oil industry lobbyist from the American Petroleum Institute became the chief of staff in the White House Environmental Policy Office, the Council on Environmental Quality, and clearly was taking over the role of sort of policing climate change communication. Now, it became evident over time that he was involved in directing the federal agencies to delete all the references, all the work on the National Climate Assessment. And he would even go so far as to take reports that had been prepared by the scientists in the program and approved by 13 agencies as ready to go, and in the 12th hour send them back marked up in his own hand over the fax machine with the changes he wanted to make. There were changes of the sort that created an enhanced and manufactured sense of the fundamental scientific uncertainty of it all. So adding adjectives and deleting phrases and making it all look like the scientists didn't really understand what the scientists did understand. And anything that had to do with the impacts, the potentially harmful impacts of climate change on ecosystems and resources was questioned or taken out. References to the National Climate Impacts Assessment were taken out. References to the fossil fuel energy and its contribution to climate change were taken out. I mean, if you've ever worked with an editor, you know that you can go through and change a line, add a line, delete a line, change a word, alter a phrase, and you can change the whole tone and meaning of a document. And that's what I was seeing. It was all in one direction. It wasn't, how can we communicate this more precisely, more accurately? It was, how can I make this look the way the White House wants it to look? And the feds they have their antenna out to what's politically sensitive to the White House. He didn't have to do that very many times before the feds that I was working with started censoring themselves and toning down the way they put things just to avoid getting crosswise with the White House. And this was not good. When I saw it happening, I just, particularly if you don't just, are not just bent to your lab science, but you're in that interface between research and the wider world, which is what the whole thing was supposed to be about. And you see how difficult that communication is to begin with. And then you have a politico, a lobbyist, throwing shrapnel into that communication process for reasons that had a clear agenda. I found it very troubling. He was an attorney, right, and had been the climate team leader at the American Petroleum Institute, which is the trade association, the big lobbying arm of the major oil companies. And it was at the American Petroleum Institute in the late 90s, this came out in documents later and was reported in the New York Times, where a group of people who I later came to refer to as the global warming denial machine came together and strategized about how they were going to create an enhanced sense of uncertainty about global warming in order to diffuse any sense of urgency about regulating the industry. And one of the ways they were going to do it was to bring out scientists who may have been in a small minority within their field, but who's had contrarian or skeptic views that were congenial to the industry, and elevate them. I saw them elevating a few scientists in the political process and in the media to create the appearance that there was a big debate within the scientific community about the reality of global warming or the human contribution to it, and it's had a major political effect in blowing smoke on public opinion, distorting media coverage, and providing talking points for politicians who had their own reasons for not wanting to see action. And you could see that kind of thing going on in the media and in the political process. But what had happened was the global warming denial machine wasn't just in the think tanks. Now, it had moved right into the administration and was coming right into the science program and spinning their politics right back into the research program. And I thought that was undermining the credibility and integrity of the program. Well, when the hand markups came in, and one feels like one is complicit. Am I going to just key these things in? Am I going to raise an issue? Well, what happens to you if you start arguing back to the White House? This was not a White House that cared to be argued with. I made copies of the documents, and I said to and I showed them to one staff member, just for a reality check. Are we seeing what we're seeing here? What we think we're seeing here? Oh, yes, we are. And I thought, this is a story that has to come out. Someday the story has to come out, but it can't come out from me as long as I need to be employed here. So let's see if we can just limit the damage and keep an eye on what's going on. But from that point on, I started being very observant of what was going on. The State Department Kyoto Protocol negotiator, or non-negotiator, all of a sudden he's at the table now, along with the oil industry lobbyist from the White House Environmental Office, and the head of the program was a political appointee at the Commerce Department. He was a moderate, he wasn't an ideologue, but all of a sudden, instead of the people around the table of the Global Change Research Program Board of Directors being career science technocrats, there was the voice of the White House was right in the room. And instead of being a collegial process, it became more of a top-down process. It really corrupted the communication. And I started keeping a record of that. I started keeping notes on what I was saying. I started sometimes even going home in the evening and getting out my recorder and dictating a contemporaneous record of what I had seen downtown that day. It was too much to write. So I think I was documenting, I was observing. I was a bit circumspect about how much of a dissident I was coming to experience myself as there, because just of the whole culture of the place. But a lot of people could see it. Other people on the staff could see it. Science managers could see it. Scientists could see it, but they couldn't see certain specific things that I could see because they weren't dealing with the documents. They weren't in the room when certain things were happening. So there was an inside story that wasn't coming out. I made various efforts along those lines. For example, when I was told by the White House Science Office in the first year of the Bush administration to delete these references to the National climate assessment and the IPCC report, I wrote a memo of protest to the high official at the National Science Foundation who was chairing the program, to the executive director of the coordination office. I was in laying out the situation and that I found it problematic. That received no response. That material was deleted. People that I thought were on the wavelength of honest communication, I would raise issues with, and I would get, well, they won the election. We work for them now. To which my response was, we don't work for them as part of their political apparatus. This is a science program. This is part of the science we work under them. We have to deal with them, but since when have you become a political? I would raise it with one of the people in one of the agencies who was one of the old pros in the program, one of the best, I thought. And I said, you're not a political appointee, you're a senior executive, you're a career person. He said, all I know is these people tell me what to do, and when they tell me what to do, I do it. And I came to think of it, I didn't have the term in mind, but really there's a whole piece to be written on this that I haven't done. Is I started thinking of it as the silence of the feds. Actually, I sat here in the Gap office one day with a screenwriter, John Colley, who wrote the film Master and Commander. And he wrote the screenplay for that little animated thing about the penguins, Magic Feet or something, Happy Feet or whatever. And he was doing a documentary on global warming, and he found me and he interviewed me, and after doing a long brain dump for him, he said, I think the most interesting part of your story is how a whole town full of senior professional people who know better fall silent in the face of political misrule. And so I was disappointed to see the lack of pushback from the senior executives. I can understand it from their point of view. I didn't have a big budget to protect. I didn't have a scientist to support out of my line item. I wasn't in the line of fire in quite the same way, and yet I was disappointed. I mean, what does it take to get the integrity of pushback when you see systematic? And there were things going on that I didn't even realize till later, till other people chimed in after I went public. I mean, disappearing websites and scientists told not to answer press questions after 20 years of research had documented ocean acidification. People bringing me aside and telling me things that were going on, calling me up and saying, I'm told to not refer to carbon dioxide and global warming in the same sentence, and scientists told not to clear any web postings with headquarters. And I mean, it went on and on and on. If your goal is to politically interfere with legitimate communication, there are many modalities for doing that. If someone's going to be testifying before Congress, you just have the vice president's office cut the substantive material out of the testimony and leave the bureaucratic stuff and let it go forward. And then everybody has to act like they're a good soldier. So there were many, many things going on. I saw a piece of it. I saw a key piece of it. I really held it very close. I didn't want to cause problems for staff. I did not want to tip off higher-ups who would be or could be in an adversarial position such that they might be able to undercut what I'd finally decided to do. I did talk about it with my wife, Karen. She was totally supportive. She could see the effect. I mean, it has a very corrosive effect on your morale when you're inside these situations and you're seeing what you think is an abuse of power, and you can't make it stop. And when the second Bush term started, the beginning of 2005. There were several indications. They would take a long time to explain. There were several indications that the political policing was going to get worse, not better. You know, the message was clear. So I felt that there was really nothing more that I could do there. But I didn't have another job to go to. I finally realized that I wasn't looking for another job because I didn't want the head of a new position to say, well, we're not going to be dealing with that issue. You're going to be doing this instead. I knew what I needed to do. I just didn't know a way forward for how to do it. But there was one day, I had just come back from a climate science conference in Palo Alto. I was really the only person from the program who was out there for it. It was all the top scientists. Their frustration was so palpable with trying to get their climate science through the gauntlet of mediocre media coverage and political opposition and public scientific illiteracy. And I was coming back to Washington from San Francisco, and I thought, Piltz, you're not doing what you need to do. You know, that's your community. That's who you're, in terms of your values, that's the community you're really answerable to. Not these feds, not these politicians. Make a move. And I got back to Washington, and the situation with the program was so arid by comparison with the freewheeling conversation in the science world. And it was just the next thing that happened was just the straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, one more thing happened, and I found myself saying, okay, that's it. I'm not doing this anymore. I said to my executive director, you want to do this project under these terms? You do it. I'm not doing it. And I thought, I hadn't gone into the office that day intending to do that, but I thought, oh my God, I think I just resigned. Well, the executive director set up a meeting for me with the Commerce Department, Assistant Secretary, some cabinet official, political appointee, to discuss this. And the next day, and I wrote up a memo with about 20 bullet items documenting how I thought the leadership had run the program off the rails in terms of its credibility and integrity. And he looked at it and he said, well, there's some truth to this. Actually, I'm quite convinced that all 20 of them were quite true. None of them have ever really been challenged. And he said, but I'm not going to make this the basis of a conversation with you. I mean, you've made a great contribution to the program for a long time. You're a respected person, but the election's over. So the message was essentially, I've got a business to run here. This is what we're dealing with. So I went home and sent a resignation in at that point. And I had not told anyone in advance that I was going to do that. Now, I did have a connection with Andrew Revkin at the New York Times, who was giving good coverage of the issue. He's really probably the only daily newspaper reporter in the country who had climate change and global environment as a beat. And I talked with him on background a few times. He was someone who actually understood the program and the cast of characters and the issues. So after I resigned, I did send him an email saying, free at last, free at last. And he said, okay, now will you talk to me? So I think it was generally widely understood. The more proximate you were to that interface between the science and the White House, the political arena, the more you could see it. Not everybody saw the same documents. I saw one document. For example, it was the almost final version of a strategic plan for research. This is 2003, that had a large number of significant statements in it about climate change, and it came back from the White House Science Office with 400 edits. They were electronic. They didn't have a name. It wasn't in handwriting. It didn't look iconic, but I tracked through. And the leadership of the program was going to farm the edits out to staff and say, you put the edits in for this chapter, you put the edits in for that chapter. And I thought, wait a minute. We're going to put 400 of this guy's edits into a strategic plan that everybody's worked on for a year and that has integrity. Now we're going to change the whole communication. I sat up all night taking samples, a few sample chapters, and with the way you do with amendments to a bill with underlining and strike-throughs, showed how the edits would change the document. And I gave it to the director of the program. And he actually took on the oil industry lobbyist and argued with him about it and backed him down on a lot of it. But the censorship of the National Climate Impacts Assessment stayed in place. And it was just obviously I think that people knew that we were dealing with something that lacked intellectual and scientific integrity, that was politicizing the process. There were people who weren't affected by it on a daily basis. They were managing a science program. They were sending people to Antarctica. They were running computer models. They could do their work. They had their funding. They could keep their head down. They weren't looking for political conflict anyway. They were averse to controversy. Most of these feds, they're not boat rockers. That's not who self-selects into the civil service science management world. They might be intellectual boat rockers in science, but they're not political boat rockers. So I think there was a general understanding that there was a problem, but maybe I assigned it a higher priority. I think maybe I did that, and maybe I took it more personally. I don't know, it's like, who becomes a whistleblower? I mean, I had to, when this guy's edits came to me, I mean, there was a part of me that said, who do you think you're dealing with? Do you think I'm one of you? I'm not one of you. You put this in front of me, I'm going to tell what you're doing. Just not long ago, I had dinner, ran into him in a Mexican restaurant in Friendship Heights with a former colleague who was always very enthusiastic about what I'd done. But I said, how many people in the program would have done, in my position, would have done what I did? And he said, 0. Why do people not become whistleblowers? It's going to be career limiting. I mean, I walked away from the job first. I thought about it long and hard. I calculated that I could do that for a while without bringing immediate economic crisis and calamity down on my wife and daughter's heads. I didn't have to be afraid of them about the next paycheck. I was free to walk away and find another way, to take some time to find another way. But people who are and I wasn't a career civil servant. I was there as on a grant to the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research in Boulder through the National Science Foundation. As a number of people in that office were. I was not a Fed. I wasn't going to collect a pension. So people are afraid that it will affect their budget, it will affect their promotability. And as I say, they're not boat rockers. Maybe I'm a little bit more boat rocker than they were. Maybe I have, have been willing to do that and walk away from things if I didn't think they were right. They probably thought it wouldn't make any difference. They would think, what am I going to say? Who would I say it to? I would just be arguing with the White House. I had documented things, and there was a reporter at the New York Times who was interested. There's not that many people would find themselves in that position, but I had no idea what would come of it. I resigned without a plan except I am now free to speak. That's all. And then I found Gap. I was referred to Gap. I had heard of Gap, but I had never really connected with it. I think I'd heard of Gap in connection with the nuclear plants in Texas from years earlier, but I didn't really know it. But I got on the phone with Louis Clark, and I must say Louis picked up almost instantly what I was talking about, why it mattered, where I was coming from, why it was potentially significant. He got it and was very supportive, and so we began to work together on how to do this because I was concerned. I was concerned about what legal exposure I might have if I made documents, internal documents that were so-called pre-decisional. I thought it was all right, but I needed to be reassured. Yes, you didn't put out any classified documents. You haven't accused anyone of committing a crime. You're not even trying to hold on to your job. You are Citizen Piltz calling attention to what you think is an abuse of power and documenting it. You're a whistleblower. Your position is legitimate. But Gap made gestures to show that it was supporting me, even in the first article that came out, as a way of saying that I wasn't alone, that if someone was going to come after me, they would have to come after me through Gap, and Gap knew what it was talking about, and Gap knew what it was doing. So that was very helpful. It was very reassuring. And then the Gap sort of walked me through the process of getting material released. And I also kind of took time to go off and write a 9,000-word memorandum addressed to all the top leaders of the program, which we posted, and I sent to them. Painstakingly detailed and in a very calm way, describing what I thought the problem was and why I had left and what I thought their responsibility in the matter was. And I think Tom Devine didn't think it was quite punchy enough to use for a public statement, but my goal was to establish that I really knew what I was talking about. It was to establish insider credibility and gravitas and seriousness of purpose, and to put something on the record in that vein, and so I did. It was sent to essentially all of what they called the principals, the top representative from each of the 13 agencies in the program, and the director of the program, the director of the program office. And there's the board of directors, all the top leaders of the Global Change Research Program, was addressed to them collectively in memo form. And this is kind of like this is why I left. This is what I think the problem is, and I think I can do more for the program by talking truthfully about what's going on there than I can staying in the program at this point, if one is talking about protecting that. I think it's been absolutely essential. I've had, on the whole, a very good experience with the media. I think media coverage has been absolutely essential in getting the story out and following up in other ways on it. There was in June of 2005, the New York Times ran a front page story Above the fold, as they say, White House aide edited climate reports, softened links to greenhouse gases. And it was a good story. It was my whistleblower story, and it even had a graphic of a marked up document. And I don't know, maybe it wasn't the fastest news day, but poor Scott McClellan, President Bush's White House press secretary, had to take about 15 or 20 questions on this thing from the White House press corps when he stood up for them that day. What's this? And who's, what? And he didn't know what to say. He had two talking points. We're for science, and this was a routine process. And they would say, yes, but the New York Times has this, and the New York Times says you have an oil industry lobbyist, and the New York Times has this whistleblower, and finally he did, and this is the classic thing. He said, well, who's this whistleblower? Why don't you investigate him? Classic. Well, so it was a good story, and I thought, wow, good. That's good, now I can sink like a stone. And but I was planning to come into the Gap office that afternoon, kind of like, well, now what? And I got a call. I got a call from Dylan Blaylock, I think it was, and he said, you really need to get down here. There are some people who want to talk to you. And I thought, uh-oh, who wants to talk to me? And he said, well, NBC, CBS, ABC, NPR, CNN. It was like everybody but Fox, Washington Post. And so the story had legs, and I did all those interviews and follow-ups, and the BBC and radio and PBS, and later the next year CBS 60 Minutes, and then PBS Frontline. There was a lot. And I think one of the things that made the story work was the 2 days after it broke, the oil industry lobbyist resigned from the White House. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting, because this White House specializes in being impervious. I mean, they really do not give a damn what you think. And this guy resigned. And then about 3 days after that, it was announced in the Times that he had taken a position with ExxonMobil and was leaving for Dallas. And I thought, well, that's more like it. There's the old boot in the face, They don't care what you think. But that made it now it wasn't a science story. It was a political story. It was a fox guarding the chicken coop story. And it was a concise, elegant little narrative that you didn't need to know anything about greenhouse gases and polar bears and ecosystems to get. And I think that's why it worked. Well, it did. The folks at Gap were very helpful in, first of all, just navigating the process of going from sitting at home writing a memorandum to getting media coverage. I mean, navigating me through the thing with the New York Times, teeing up the interviews that we did in the Gap office the day the story came out, coaching me, going along with me when we did that press availability in the Capitol with Senator Reid and Senator Schumer, how to deal with them, how to deal with interviews, how to think about whistleblowing, how to discuss whistleblowing. I had never really given much thought to whistleblowing as a type of activity. I mean, of course, I knew all about Daniel Ellsberg, I had met Daniel Ellsberg in the long ago, and I knew about Serpico, and I knew about Karen Silkwood, and I knew about Enron and so forth, but I wasn't really a student of whistleblowing until I found myself in the position of being one. I wasn't even quite sure whether that was the appropriate way to label what I had done. And it became clear enough to me, yes, it was an appropriate way to label what I had done. So it was an education working with GAP. And then we got into talking about what to do next, because I had the idea for so you get rid of one guy, they bring another guy in. You rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic. Framing the narrative for public discourse was important, and I think this, among other things, played a role in helping see that the Bush administration had a problem with global warming that had to do with integrity and wasn't just a legitimate policy debate because these guys knew better. So it was important for that, but there was so much more of that still to talk about, and no one was really focused on it. And it seemed to clearly be my role in the public interest community to be a watchdog, to hold government accountable for using climate science with integrity. It wasn't an environmental project, it was a government accountability project. And so I became allied and associated with GAP through the follow-up on that watchdog activity. Well, so now it's 2013, and I'm continuing to do the Climate Science Watch project that I initiated in 2005 after becoming a whistleblower. And Climate Science Watch is a program of GAP. GAP has been essential for the development of that and helping to keep it supported over the years. I've had great research assistants and interns who have officed at GAP. GAP has worked with me on communications. I work with GAP in participating in the American Whistleblower Tour. So we have an ongoing relationship. But Climate Science Watch has its own watchdog role. It has its own vocabulary. I work pretty independently in talking to the media. I'm going to be talking to Canadian Broadcasting tomorrow, for example. I testified before Congress a few times on political interference with federal climate scientists. I developed my own testimony. The climate science website I write independently. So GAP has been great to work with in terms of collaboration and also allowing the project to find its own way and its own voice. I'm not sure how I would have done this otherwise, to tell you the truth. Yeah, so with working with GAP in late 2005, after we did the whistleblower action, I started the Climate Science Watch project as a follow-on to the whistleblowing, and to pursue the same issues that I had identified as problematic when I blew the whistle on the administration's political interference. It's the problem is holding government accountable for using the climate science, the climate research with integrity and effectiveness in policymaking. And I guess that's the mission of Climate Science Watch, the specific role that it plays. Should we even need a project to do this? It turns out to be extremely difficult. Climate change has confronted the political system and society with a problem that it seems ill-equipped to deal with. The science is complex. It involves the fossil fuel energy industry, which is very powerful and very set on its path and not wanting to be interfered with. It involves the energy use that implicates our whole way of life. We have a public that has a lot of immediate priorities to worry about and not much scientific literacy. The world of science and advancing scientific understanding is one thing. The scientists have identified and are characterizing a problem, but the problem has to be dealt with in a completely different arena of the public arena, the policy arena, the political arena. And there, the value systems are different. There's all sorts of agendas running. Some of those agendas are really toxic. And so there turns out to be considerable amount of work to be done. Basically, it's not science education so much. If science education were sufficient, we would be farther along. It's not what can we do with solar energy. If that were sufficient, we would be farther along. And it's not, well, here are some very good policy wonk ideas for what government could do if government were being reasonable, because we have a mountain of that and it doesn't happen. Clearly, the impediments are on the political receiving end of the research. My project is based inside the Washington, D.C. Beltway, and it's one of the most expert projects from a public interest, independent, critical point of view, watchdogging the federal government on how it's dealing with the climate change problem and this disconnect, or this maybe you should say collision between the science and the politics. And so we're dealing mostly with what happens on the political receiving end here in Washington. Well, during the Bush administration, we were pushing a lot on problems with the administration and how they were handling climate change. And over a period of time, the heavy hand of direct censorship seemed to lift. But at that point, it was evident that they weren't actually going to do anything. It's that they didn't have to censor it because they were just going to ignore it. When the Obama administration came in, the configuration changed, and it did seem that the system was perhaps finally poised to act after a couple decades of being aware of the global warming problem. People expected there would be major legislation, that there would be major leadership from the Obama administration, that there would be new diplomatic international agreements, that there would be regulation of greenhouse gases. That all turned out to be much more difficult to achieve than a lot of people thought, because I think confronted with the idea that change might actually mean change, the anti-government, anti-regulation ideologues and the corporate interests mounted a ferocious pushback. And a fair amount of it took the form of an attack on the integrity of climate science, an attack on the personal integrity of leading climate scientists. I mean, this went even beyond what the tobacco industry did. I mean, they never launched personal attacks about cancer researchers. You know, I mean, they talked about scientific uncertainty, but this was like trying to criminalize scientists. So there was that. The global warming denial machine was very aggressive. At the same time, it appeared that the Obama administration had made a political decision that this was just too sensitive. This was a heavy lift politically to really speak truthfully to the American public about the meaning of climate change and the kind of changes that would be needed. Was an investment, a political investment of capital that President Obama just didn't want to make. And a kind of a climate silence descended over Washington for about 3 years after 2009, and has only been lifted very recently this year, as the president has announced, has made speeches, a major address for the first time by any American president about climate change and why it's important. and has laid out a 52-point climate action plan, which is something that we're gearing up to watchdog the implementation of. You know, we've kind of been around long enough to know that these plans are not self-executing, and there's sometimes a real disconnect between the rhetoric at the top and the reality on the ground. But also there seems to be a contradiction at the heart of Obama's climate and energy policy, because while he's saying good things about climate change, his administration still seems committed to increasing the extraction and development and burning and export of fossil fuels. Deep water drilling, I mean, an unconventional, risky production. On deep water drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, drilling for oil in the Arctic Ocean, mountaintop removal, coal mining, huge amounts of coal leasing on federal lands in the West without any kind of broad environmental impact analysis, leasing of oil production on federal lands. Now the coal industry wants to take the coal that's not being burned in this country and export it to Asia, so now proposed coal export terminals. So the administration is saying one thing, but in other ways is doing another. And there's really much to be looked at. And I think the only way we're going to understand some of what's really going on is from inside sources. We need people to say, and with some of it you can go after with Freedom of Information Act requests. Some of it you can just see from studying it. Some of it you need people on the inside who will say, yes, this is what we were told to say about fracking. This is what we were told to say about deep water drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. Here are the memoranda that will tell you what's actually going on. So I think they all need a watchdog. It's not just one administration. They all need a watchdog. Oh, I absolutely would. Yes, I mean, I've watched GAP in operation, not just on stuff that has to do with my program, but how GAP operates in general. This is an organization with real integrity, real expertise, great people who are real public servants, really conscientious and savvy staff. And I think it's a trustworthy organization with people who know what they're doing. They won't take a case if it's not a good case. If they can see that there's a problem, they'll say that there's a problem. I think that people can be confident in consulting with GAP that they will be talking to people who know how to do what is appropriate to the situation. And when the GAP decides to get involved in the fight, the other side is going to know that it's been in a fight. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I know that some whistleblowers took a much harder, much more devastating blow than I did. I mean, people lost their careers and couldn't recover. People lost marriages and homes. They lost their mental health. You know, I mean, so sometimes the system comes down so hard on a whistleblower, or a whistleblower is struggling in other ways. So I had a comparatively soft landing. So I can't totally generalize from my case, but I did get support for what I was doing. I had strong interpersonal support around me. I had strong professional support. As a matter of fact, I found a whole new network of colleagues and allies I didn't even know were there once I made a commitment to step out. My story got told. I've been able to work on doing what I think needs to be done. I mean, I did walk away from a federal government type salary to work in the public interest community, so I suppose if you added it all up, my financial situation would be stronger now, than if I hadn't. But, my bills are paid, and, my daughter's being put through school, and so I came out of it feeling like it was worthwhile. It was essential. It opened doors for me to have an experience as a free public voice, working with really strong allies. That was actually a better situation than I was in during the years that I was on the inside. I mean, it was a real education for me working inside the research program and also working on the Hill. But when you do that, you trade your freedom of speech for inside influence. And that's what Washington is really about, for the most part, is people who have traded their public freedom of speech for inside influence. And that can be great if you're having a good influence and the people you're working under represent your values. But it didn't work for me when I couldn't support the values of the leadership. So being in a situation where I am free to speak and write and feel like I do have some influence in helping to shape the public discourse has been real good. Oh, that's a mixed bag. I learned a lot about my old network when I became a whistleblower. I got a lot of support. It was evident enough from specific things that a number of people said to me, and also just from the way they treated me when we crossed paths later, even if we did not go back over the story, that I was highly regarded, that nobody was sorry to see this guy go who resigned from the White House. A number of people were like, yeah, right on. Then there were a few people who didn't want, if I would see them in a public meeting, they would literally walk around the room the long way around to avoid having to go across my path. There were people that I thought were allies who would not return my phone calls. They were running so scared. I could see the pressure they were under, but nevertheless. So I think that on the whole, I have felt really the only one that I heard any criticism from was the political appointee at the top of the program, who I've been told said he thought what I did was inappropriate. But he told me that when I resigned. He called me up and he said, well, I see you've resigned. I guess you've preempted any further conversation. He said, I would admonish you that you should not release any pre-decisional documents. That's professionalism. And I said, well, what you're saying really is that nobody has a right to know anything that until the Bush administration has decided what to tell them. I said, so actually I'm taking as my model in this someone like Richard Clarke, who had written Against All Enemies, and when he resigned after we went into Iraq, he did a memoir. He kept his sights trained on the high political officials. You want me to tell you what Paul Wolfowitz said to Colin Powell and what Colin Powell said to Condi Rice? Here's what happened. He let the middle managers off scot-free, but he told the truth about the political higher-ups. And I said, that's how I'm going to approach this. And he didn't respond to that. But I was concerned about what he would say. Disgruntled former employee, blah, blah, blah. So I said, let's just have a détente here. You don't badmouth me in the media, and I won't badmouth you personally in the media, because I'm not really interested in you. I'm interested in the White House. And that held up. It was in January and early February of 2007. The Democrats had just regained their majority in the House after 12 years in the minority, and Henry Waxman of California had become the new chairman of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. And the very first hearing he held was on January 30th, 2007, was on allegations of political interference with federal climate scientists. And there were 4 of us on the panel. And then 2 months later, he had a second one, and he had Phil Cooney from the oil industry lobbyist sitting next to Jim Hansen, the NASA climate scientist, at the witness table. So it was part of a pair of hearings. So I testified, and it was a very substantial hearing. I was actually questioned by 12 different members. There were a lot of people showed up for that, and the members were very well briefed. So I got a lot of good questions, and then there were 2 people on the Republican side who tried to shake my testimony, most notably Darrell Issa, who's now the chairman of the House Oversight Committee. And he tried to undercut what I was saying, and when I tried to respond to him, he cut me off. And he thought he had nailed it, and I looked at Chairman Waxman, and as soon as we were done, Mr. Waxman said, "Mr. Piltz, would you like to finish your answer?" Let me do that. That was a good hearing. And 1 week later, the same subject matter in the Senate, before the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. So they had oversight of the White House Science Office, NASA, NOAA, National Science Foundation, key agencies. And sitting on my left was the scientist who had won the Nobel Prize for the stratospheric ozone depletion chemistry, and he supported essentially what I was saying. And sitting on my right was the director of the Global Change Research Program, who I had resigned from. He was in an uncomfortable position. And it was also a good hearing. Senator Kerry really dug in and asked a lot of good questions, and it was quite something to have the opportunity to have that kind of an exchange with him. Senator Lautenberg from New Jersey, Senator Inouye from Hawaii, and Senator Nelson from Florida all asked pretty good questions. So that was a great, and it was also enabled us to establish some good new contacts with the relevant key congressional offices. So we were able to work with staff and advise them on future hearings, things that they should be looking into, questions that they should be asking. They did on the House side, a whole major investigation of the Council on Environmental Quality. They forced thousands of additional documents out of CEQ from the Bush administration that showed not only what I had experienced, but a lot of additional stuff, the direct connections between Phil Cooney and Vice President Cheney's office and so forth. So there was good follow-up, I thought.